Hi, everyone. My name is Danny Nierenberg. I am president of Food Tank. I'm so excited to launch this 5-part live stream series about the Refresh Working Group's Food Plus Tech policy platform. The Refresh Working Group is a multi-stakeholder platform made up of farmers, academics, entrepreneurs, chefs, advocates, technologists, and other experts who really wish to explore the complex intersection of agriculture, food, and technology. Over the next 5 days, my co-host, Chloe Sorvino, who leads coverage of food and agriculture at Forbes, and I will ask our panelists about ways to educate policymakers, how to advocate for thoughtful and intentional policies governing technology, and the need for participatory development of technologies to solve the problems and develop solutions that farmers and eaters actually need. The platform has 5 pillars, including supply chain transparency, physical and digital food security, broadband expansion, data protection, and a digitally skilled workforce. The entire platform is available at foodtank.com. Today's discussion will focus on supply chain transparency. A lack of transparency along the supply chain has multiple impacts, from lower prices for farmers because they lack data, as well as food loss and food waste, which is often unseen, ignored, or implicitly accepted as the cost of doing business. So to look at these questions and many others, we have a great panel who I will introduce briefly. Dana Gunders is the executive director of Whitted. Mark Kaplan is the founder of Whole Chain and Invisible and a member of the Refresh Working Group. Matt Wadiak is the founder and chief executive officer of Cook's Venture. And Rick Whitted is the chief executive officer of U.S. Hunger, and he is also a member of the Refresh Working Group. Welcome to you all. Thanks to everyone who's watching and listening, and really a huge thanks to you, Chloe, for being here. I'm so glad to have somebody with your expertise kicking off this panel. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. When I consider the scale of our food system and all the vast and complex problems within each sector, it can really seem very daunting. But there are a few solutions that could be as impactful as using technology to ensure supply chain transparency in all of its various forms. And throughout this panel, we'll hear about how it's being tested in different applications, like decreasing food waste and hunger, but also how to ensure your chicken is actually antibiotic-free when the label claims it is. We hear all the time about how in a capitalistic society, we need to vote with our dollars. But what happens when you can't totally trust what you buy? These technologies now give us the tools to track what is actually being supported. Think about it. Blockchain can now be the answer to making sure the beef you buy isn't responsible for deforestation in the Amazon, or the shrimp that you buy wasn't manufactured with slave labor. So given all of that, I want to kick it off. This panel is all about empowering consumers through transparency, from better labels to establishing standards for food traceability and cybersecurity. So can each of our panelists briefly share one game-changing technology that their organization or business wouldn't run without?
Yeah, I'll kick that off. Thank you all for having us, and thank you, Danny and Chloe, for letting me participate in this. You know, at Invisible, we buy and sell fully traceable seafood. Like, that is the core of our business. So we set up the company with fully traceable supply chains in the vision for creating the business from the outset. So to us and to me, we see digital traceability technology as the foundation of enabling transparency in supply chains. So I'll go with that. Blockchain, mobile technology, sensors, they all feed into digital traceability technology.
Mark, that's awesome. Perhaps the only industry that has as many blockchain problems as seafood is poultry. So I'm obviously in that world. And you know, one of the problems that we find in poultry is a couple short things. Is number one, about a lot of folks don't realize, regardless of what company produces poultry, about 75% of poultry genetics come from a company called Avigen, and about 25% globally come from a company called Cobb, owned by Tyson. And regardless of what your chicken says on a label, whether it's organic or free range or whatever, there really is no traceability as to what's going into those ingredients, and also the value add ingredients like chicken nuggets that are coming through those into plants. So one of the things that we do is we work with a company called Food ID, which is Bill Nyman's company. And we're currently the only poultry company in America to test and verify every single flock is actually antibiotic free. And then much like you, we QR code that, label that on every package and show that methodology directly to our customers, which is a big game changer for the industry.
So this is Rick. I'm coming in from probably a different angle, being a virtual food bank. And we have used a combination of online surveying, geospatial technology, and predictive algorithms to, one, track the more than 70,000 boxes of food that we've sent directly to the front door of families in need. And what's so interesting is when that's your business, if you understand your business more efficiently, you begin to understand hunger better. And so looking forward to talking about that. But that combination of geospatial technology using predictive algorithms have really given us a SaaS-like platform that we're using to really help us answer some questions and ask different questions about hunger.
You're on mute, Dana.
There we go. What I was saying was that's really interesting, Rick. I can't wait to hear more about that. When you stop and think about food loss and waste across the supply chain and why it's happening, there are a number of ways that better information can actually help. And it's not so much that we need like the trust component of blockchain, but we do appreciate that when you have the information that travels along the supply chain, that really helps. So if you have, for instance, date stamps, so that can really help you understand the shelf life that's remaining and when something was harvested. If you have information on temperature exposure and just different kind of movement around the country, around the supply chain, that can all help inform how product is used, especially in a way that you can use what's about to expire sooner. And if you know when something was harvested or how much shelf life it has remaining, that can help you more precisely price it to sell, use some last minute flash sale options and things like that to really get food used in the end.
Great. Thank you all for those great first comments. Mark, I want to come back to you for a second because,
Sure.
You and I have had these conversations for a long time about a fully traceable supply chain and kind of what that means. And you come from a long business background of really studying these things at Unilever and elsewhere. I think what average folks have a hard time understanding, whether it's my mom or even, people who work at some of the companies, at Unilever, they have a hard time understanding blockchain. And I'm wondering if you can give us sort of this, just an overview of what it actually means and what it does.
Sure. Well, blockchain really is distributed ledger technology. I know that's just another buzzword, but just fundamentally leaving it there. The way I describe it to folks who aren't tech savvy is really it's a trusted way to share data across from group to group that aggregates data as data is shared from one user to another. I even go so far as to use sticky notes when I visually represent it to people, and you just attach the next note as the data goes up the supply chain. So at the end, it's a composite that can't be tampered with. And as early as this morning, we were talking about tracing cocoa with a group that's concerned about a cooperative potentially manipulating data if it were in a spreadsheet or clipboard. And once it's hashed to blockchain, you really can't do that. So that's the way I try to demystify it.
No, that's great. I love the sticky note analogy. Go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in and just say, for practical purposes, we see this all the time in supply chain where, for example, we can go and test organic grain and try to get verification on whether grain was organic or not organic when labeled. So, and, we're feeding our animals organic grains in some cases that are just based in affidavit systems in Eastern Europe or Brazil or somewhere. And we know as a fact, and there's been like wide reporting on this, that there are literally tens of millions of pounds of falsified products. May they be, grains for animal feed or seafood or other animals for human consumption every single year, getting to grocery shelves because that blockchain or that supply chain is not well managed and is oftentimes just, somebody's signature in a different part of the world. And we actually, in the US, don't have really great, robust systems to prevent that today.
Thank you for bringing that in. I wanted to ask more, Dana was talking about this too with labeling requirements. I want to understand how standards would make this clearer because, there's so many different parts of labels that could be problematic. And Matt, honestly, you were the COO of Blue Apron. You created the supply chain of 250 people. So I'm sure you have a lot of different places where you've seen this all as well. But even for meat in the country, it's pretty much only verified by the USDA once every year. Right. And Whole Foods will tell me that they rely on the USDA to do this. So there's so much more that needs to be done. So for Dana, Matt, and anyone else who has any thoughts, how would better label standards make this clearer for customers? And what else would you want to see on labels?
Well, for one, USDA is an affidavit-based system. So anything that's written on an affidavit, basically a promissory note, is the regulation in which the USDA adheres to. So whether or not that affidavit is true or false, when there's a premium price for organic grain versus conventional grain, there's going to be some human nature to falsify some of those documents to create higher profit. And we've seen a lot of that fraud in the US. The other problem is that when you're looking at, for example, further processed goods, if you go to buy deli meat or chicken nuggets, only the last establishment number of the plant that manufactured those ingredients is going to be listed on the packaging. None of the ingredients that go into that are listed on the packaging. So you lose that traceability at the last step. And you could have 10 steps before that are not documented.
Building on Matt's point, in seafood, which is really like we felt that the Frank Sinatra test of traceability, if we can do it in seafood, we can do it anywhere. We really see it. There's two things on standards. One, the industry has gotten together recognizing that there are issues like Matt's talking about and created data standards with the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability. So that's been done, and we actually were, I believe, the first to bring them to market in a program that matched that standard with the other type of voluntary standard being sustainability, which is oftentimes, again, like I promise we're sustainable. So we matched that up with fair trade in one supply chain. And from our procurement business, we make full traceability a requirement of our program. So we won't purchase your seafood and make you part of our program unless you commit to full traceability. And full traceability means to the actual source, not just the distribution center where a lot of that manipulation happens that Matt's talking about. We've actually ended up terminating 2 very large seafood companies because they refused to go fully traceable. So yeah, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a different problem on the loss and waste side of things. And so when it comes to actual labels, I would say the biggest challenge we face is the date, like kind of the date stamp that's on a food and what that means and how it's interpreted. And, right now there are use by, best by, sell by dates. They're essentially all treated the same. People don't understand what they mean. They often think they're telling them to throw the food out. And because which is incorrect, they're typically only about the quality of food. But because people think that they are telling them the food is bad, stores are then afraid to sell product that's anywhere close to the date. So stores are typically removing product 2 to 3 days before the date. And, there's even more sort of details within that. And so, having a date system that is standardized and regulated so that those words actually have definitions and we know what is a quality date and what actually is telling us when the food is bad. I mean, I think that's what we're after in terms of the labels themselves. But when it comes to technology, there's things that are leapfrogging that. There are like stickers and packets and different technologies that you can that are being affixed to food to sense when there's kind of a quality or usability issue with it, or a safety issue. And so, there's different things that pop up when it's been exposed to too much temperature and things like that. So there are some technology fixes that are actually getting us past the date and to a more specific evaluation.
I love that leapfrogging sort of analogy. But, Dana, since I've known you, you've been working on this, getting the labels right. And, I've known you for a decade now, if not more. Why hasn't policy gotten there? Why are we having such a hard time after a decade or more of getting labels, used by, sell by, whatever dates, federally regulated?
Well, Danny, this is our year. I'm telling you. It's made slow progress. I certainly started working on that whole topic in 2013. So here we are 8 years later. I wish I had more progress to report, but what we have seen is that the industry has kind of galvanized around a voluntary standard for 2 dates. And there have been bills introduced to Congress to essentially codify that same standard. And what's particularly important about that is not only that it gets us to that system I was talking about, but there are about 20 states around the country that restrict the sale of product or the donation of product after that date. Now, if that date is just a quality date, it's telling you that your Cheerios are not at its top quality potentially, and it's a very conservative date at that, it's a total pity to not be able to donate that food, especially when you get to dairy and other nutritious products. And so with that legislation, there's a component about standardizing. There's also a component that says, once they're standardized and there's one date that's about quality and another date that's about safety, then the sale or donation of the quality products, the products where the dates are only about quality, cannot be restricted. And I think this is our year. I think we have, the right political context right now. I think the industry has become more and more behind it as time has gone on, and they've been able to migrate to the system anyways. And ultimately, it's easier for them because they don't have to kind of track 50 different state laws, but can just have one preemptive federal one. So this is our year.
That's great news. Chloe, over to you.
Thank you, Dana. Rick, I want to bring you in. I think a lot of folks listening might not truly understand the concept of physical food security. Could you define it?
Yeah. So when you think about the U.S. Overall, and I would tell you just a big disclaimer, according to the USDA's 2019 census, just think 2x at a minimum when those 2020 census comes out. But roughly 10.5% of the population, nearly 40 million people, do not have access to food or enough food. They're either food insecure or food insufficient. Roughly, according to the USDA, it's about 5 million of them are very food insecure as well. So they just do not have enough of access to food. What's interesting is when you start using technology to understand what you're doing and where you're feeding, what communities you're feeding in, you begin to ask different questions, and not who is hungry, but why are they hungry in the first place? And I'll tell you, being a decade-old organization, putting it all on the table, just out there, we were so proud of how many we fed and how much food we provided in our decade-long history. But when the pandemic hit and we had to figure out how to become very efficient, we started using technology to spotlight where are we sending boxes. So when it enters our food chain, we can tell you down to the street level where those boxes are going. And here's what we found out. Number one, hunger looks a lot like your neighbor. It doesn't matter where you live. I can promise you within a 2 to 10 mile radius, there's someone around you who has requested food from us. And we have roughly 55,000 applicants, 58,000 applicants right now that's in our pool. And you will see a correlation to food deserts. Sometimes those are rural areas. It's where people just don't have easy access to fresh foods, good foods. that's in a walking distance or an easily manageable way to get to it. So it's a big problem out there, and through the technology, through seeing where we're feeding, and when you begin to layer that with some of the census data that's going on and direct feedback we're getting from the families that we're helping, you begin to see the face of hunger in the U.S. And oftentimes it's not the food or the lack of food that's making them hungry. It's the right foods. They're nutritionally insecure, or it's access to that food. When I have a housing issue and I can't afford my rent, I'm trying to choose, am I going to buy good food or am I going to go to the Dollar General and pick up a Hot Pocket? And too often we see that. And when we spend $100 billion at a minimum a year in food assistance, we've got to realize that the answer is not just food alone. It's how we access that and the types of food that we're getting to those in needs. And that's just where my heart is here. So.
Yeah, Rick, if I could just jump in here, I mean, U.S. Hunger has been doing amazing work, for, as you said, more than a decade. But the pandemic has had a huge impact on your services. Can you just talk a little bit about, the last year?
Well, we woke up in late February, and a big part of our business is where we bring people together, fun environments, we pack food, and most of that goes directly to local and regional food banks and or international projects. Well, we woke up at the end of February and 90% of our business stopped overnight. And so we had to figure out very quickly, who are we and what matters and how do we make the most impact with the least amount? And that for us meant turning to technology, walking away from Google Sheets and spreadsheets and trying to figure out just-in-time information. And so when your business is feeding and you put a spotlight on getting your distribution chain integrated just in time so you can know where every box is at any moment, and then you use geospatial technology to know where that's going, and then you cross-reference that with food deserts and opportunity zones and those types of things. That wasn't our intention. I'd love to tell you we're brilliant, but when we opened ourselves to technology, we could just see things that the naked eye couldn't see before about who we were feeding. And then we did one simple thing. We just asked the question that, my aunt or grandma asked me years ago, baby, what's wrong? We just asked that question. What's wrong? What's going on? And they begin to share their stories. And so now we're using predictive algorithms to look for determinants of health in those stories and those verbatims. And we're learning that I'm hungry because I have medical issues. I'm hungry because I have housing insecurity. I'm hungry because I don't have access to enough to provide for my family. And I think it's when you get to the root causes of hunger that we will begin to solve hunger. Otherwise, you look at 2000, the food insecurity was 10.5%. 2019, it's 10.5%. It's interesting that if you look at the current dialogue, we've brought it down quite a bit. Well, in 2008, we had a spike. We were almost 15%, and it's creeped back down to where it was. We haven't dipped in over 2 decades below where we were 2 decades ago. And then if you look now, 2020, you're going to see the same spike. So hunger has followed economic cycles of plenty or lack, but we've still been in the double digits of people who are hungry. And I'm on the line with people making a difference with food. There's so much food out there. I just don't understand it.
Thank you. You brought up the nutritional deficiency problem. And I think that really gets to the heart of it, because all of this, in some ways, are externalities from industrialized agriculture. And because of that, I want to bring this to Matt, because, you're solving at Cook's Ventures problems that agribusiness companies like Tyson just don't have the incentive to solve for. And, you know, it's a major breeding operation, which requires massive amounts of data to keep track of all the different grandfather chicks and great grandfather lines. You go through this with me all the time. And can you share some of the ways that Cook's Venture has used big data through its supply chain to innovate and solve for problems that, you know, the big players just don't want to address?
Yeah, happily. And, you know, just to touch also on what Rick was saying, you know, food insecurity isn't about always what we think it is. It's your next door neighbor. And we work in rural communities where we have a number of farmers that we've brought into our program who had been living below the poverty line. So we have, you know, a system in America where we're growing food, and those folks who are growing calories for us are themselves impoverished and can't afford, you know, to eat healthy meals. And then you, of course, as we know, have 40% food waste in America, which is 10% above global averages. So, you know, I just also want to add that, you know, in the U.S., 40% of our biggest national crop, corn, is going to produce ethanol, which is subsidized. So we have a U.S. economy that is heavily reliant on subsidies that essentially the beneficiaries of those subsidies go to growing more corn and soy, which is predominantly GMO. And who's making money from that? Folks who are selling petrochemical inputs and dicamba and glyphosate and things like that. Those companies are profitable when farmers are losing money and can't afford to eat. So there are major problems associated with that. And if you really want to change the corn and soy economy outside of ethanol, you have to create markets for crops that can be grown in organic systems and regenerative systems where farmers can command living wage work for the crops they're growing. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, the two biggest genetics companies on the planet, bigger than Bayer Crop Science, you know, bigger than Monsanto, Avogen and Cobb, that completely dominate 99% of chicken breeds in America, and also other breeds, hogs, aquaculture, all kinds of genetics. They've been selected for hundreds of generations for specifically the intention for efficiency of digestion of corn and soy specifically. So when you have animals that are selected genetically under the criteria to eat corn and soy, that's what farmers grow. That's how the system works, and that's what those animals do. If you try to feed diversified crops that are better crops for farmers that create more revenue, cover crops like red winter wheat, things like sorghum, kernza, sunflower, lupin, all of the crops that would build better regenerative systems that require less synthetic inputs, so it'd be bad for big agribusiness companies, but very good for farmers, would create nutritional security, would create better living wage jobs. But we have no outlet to sell those crops in America. We have no milling infrastructure that currently accepts those feeds, and we don't have breeds of animals that enzymatically have been selected for the criteria of producing weight gain off of really good quality crops, and crops that were traditionally grown in the US in the 1920s and 30s to feed livestock. So one of the criteria that we focus on is how do we create biological systems with animals to marry that up with use of land, to grow crop rotations and select under the criteria of animals that can efficiently digest things like sorghum and sunflowers and things like that. So farmers can plant those rotations, receive more revenue for acre and higher quality crops, and also reduce reliance on input subsidy companies. I think that's really important, and it's at the crux of what ties into socially how we want to build circular economies locally, where we can grow foods, many different rotations of crops of foods to feed animals, which is the majority of agriculture in America, and create healthy animals that can then feed people in a way where we can move those subsidies then from just feeding the corn and soy system to hopefully feeding people more efficiently and develop living wages so that people don't suffer from that kind of insecurity, and also hopefully help eliminate some of the waste associated with that as well. But that's critical to change the breeding, because breeding really controls the whole macro environment of the ecosystem that then drives food insecurity, health, you know, wealth of farmers, and all of the things that drive our food system.
Thank you. And I want to stay with you just for a quick second. I'd love to hear a bit more about the way that the data you're using actually ensures the transparency, and how you're using data to make sure that the breeding is able to scale, because it takes a lot of generations to make these changes.
Right.
Before we do, I just want to say, I'm so glad you mentioned how farmers obviously, aren't getting paid because of these inputs and how that trickles down. But it's also not just obviously the farmers, it's obviously the plant workers, so many different essential workers along these lines. Like, they're really, the trickle down and the externalities run so deep through all workers really throughout the food system.
Yeah, it's a real issue, and I think there's a lack of knowledge out there that over 99% of chicken in America comes from essentially one line, Cornish cross chickens, which there's a variety of a few different breeds from these big genetics companies, the Ross 308, the Cobb 500, the variants of that. But that's literally 99+% of chicken in America, and those birds have been selected on those feedstocks for hundreds and hundreds of generations. So what we have to do that's different is collect data around running a pedigree trial with great-grandparent flock birds, the birds that produce all of the birds, to specifically select for the criteria. And I know, Chloe, you've tasted some of these secretly, but creating a criteria for how to create digestibility so that these birds, we can take them back to eating a more natural diet. If you try to take these overbred Cornish cross lines, a lot of people know them as Franken chickens, but I won't be so exaggerative. They're birds that really just do well on corn and soy. And if you try to create alternative diets for them, they don't do very well. So you have to selectively breed animals that can eat more roughage, eat nutritionally more dense food, and eat what we call low-density feedstock, feed that has more fiber and different kinds of nutrients that are more balanced to soil management. So it takes a lot of work to go through those trials, and we do dozens of them every year, where we're looking for what these animals can digest better and how we can create biological balance between soil use and actual animal farming and agriculture.
It's incredibly interesting. And Matt, you brought up so many great points, from the, agri-food industrial complex to subsidies. Dana has talked about the need for legislation around date labeling. And so I think this is really a question for all of you. How can the policy and legislative side, we had a viewer ask a question about how legislation can help, either help technologies move forward or help the right kinds of technologies move forward. I'm wondering, Mark, if you want to comment on that first.
Sure. I was actually going to make that comment when right after Dana was presenting. The FDA just in 2020 actually released their blueprint for a new era on smarter food safety, with an update to the Food Safety Modernization Act with Rule 204. And granted, it's not covering all food categories at this point, but seafood is in the first phase, and so we're paying attention to this quite closely. And their blueprint outlines a lot of what we're talking about here, with tech-enabled traceability, the smarter tools for prevention and outbreak response, new business models, and then a culture of food safety. And we've applied this to our procurement business, and not differently than what Matt was describing in terms of the industrial food complex. There's consolidated big food companies and seafood very similarly to the land-based meat business. And I think one thing we haven't talked a lot about here, and what's ready for receptivity of this kind of evolution, is the consumer is ready for this. Mm-hmm. We haven't addressed the consumer on the panel yet, but the consumer is ready for it. And I think 2020 created the enabling environment for 2021 to really push this forward. When the pandemic was first really expanding through the US, and we saw the shortages and frankly, the failure of these big meat companies to equitably, one, take care of their workers, two, take care of the consumers, and three, take care of the producers. So basically this group of big food companies is really just looking out for themselves. And the way that we've applied traceability technology to both improve equitability among the supply chain, but also to better educate consumers and improve affordability of nutritious foods to support more access to nutritious food, is by requiring full traceability, we're then able to have assurance of equitable conditions down the supply chain. And in implementing it, we were able to find pockets of value where too much value was being extracted for the value being contributed back to the supply chain. So we ended up transforming our supply chains from previously opaque from our grocer partners to fully traceable with a higher sustainability score and reducing cost, because we were able to remove the overhead of those enormous food companies and deliver the value to the processors and the producers who are actually doing the super majority of producing the food and then getting it to the end consumer. And they are big margins, like margins that would fund the evolution and deployment of technologies, subsidies, et cetera. It's all really consolidated in those handfuls of big corporates who are extracting the value and frankly not taking care of their responsibilities to act ethically.
Such great points. Rick, you look like you were nodding a bit there. I wonder if you want to comment.
So when I'm thinking totally from the perspective of the families and seniors and children who are not as fortunate to have the access that many of us have. Back in October, we launched Full Cart Fresh, which is a fresh produce version of what we do. And we went directly to the farmer. And so we are working with the collective of farms, one in the Southeast, in the South, and in the Midwest, who has figured out how to deliver fresh produce cold. For us, it was, a lot of people are delivering the hearty stuff, but we wanted to make sure that there were leafy greens and herbs and a variety of fruits. To do that, it has to come fresh and cool and insulated. We found a farmer who can do that. What really resonated me as I was listening to your conversation was the thing that stood out or was most important to him was that the American farmer was taken care of, and that anything that we were going to provide in our program came from the American farmer. So I resonated with his comments as Matt was speaking a moment ago. And I think equally important, so your questions around policy and what can we do, when I think about a lot of the feeding that's happening today, if you look at the model and all the feeding that we've recently done, it's kind of this mobile, drop it off, kind of keep moving. And that's it makes feeding faceless in many ways. And listen, it's great that I can't imagine if those folks were not getting that food. But just by tracking how and who and being transparent and where we're feeding, we learned that 3 out of 5 of the families we feed have major chronic illnesses. And each of those households reporting a chronic illness has at least 2.1 major chronic illnesses in that home. So they're not only hungry, and it's not only a food crisis, it's a health crisis. And, if you looked at that policy and just begin to think differently about what some of the more fortunate, economically fortunate Americans have, things like Instacart and Amazon, and just think about feeding differently, then we can gather that data and we can begin to understand what the face of hunger really is. Because what we found out was this is not really a hunger crisis, it's a health crisis. Even when we looked at COVID, roughly 40% of the people who have requested food from us, and again, we're talking about a population of nearly 60,000 food surveys. Most of the people that requested it that said COVID was one of the reasons that they were coming to us. That's about 40% of our population. We thought it would be job loss. We thought it would be financial hardship. 80% of them, it was medically related. Like the biggest correlating vector was a medical condition. That's not odd because we deliver food directly to the folks in need front door. And so when you think about the people who organically found their way to us, it was seniors and or families who with those medical conditions, it just wasn't safe to go out and try to get food. So when I think from a policy standpoint on the feeding side of things, we really should reevaluate and focus the feeding on understanding what's driving the need for food. And that includes things that we're all grateful to have, Instacart models and Amazon models. And as a food bank, we figured out that's really important for a subset of folks who have accessibility, many due to medical conditions.
And can I just add to Rick, that's some really good points. And talking about policy, I don't want to get too political here, but I do want to say that we just had 4 years of nightmarish food policy in America. Farm Bill was gutted, SNAP's in shambles. And now we have a new administration. And I just want to say one thing about this, because there's a lot of food advocates listening. We cannot go back to food policy 10 years ago. That's not going to work for us. And that just getting back to where we were is not good enough. We have to move the ball forward. And we have a responsibility as food leaders to be advocates of public policy and go out there and make our voices heard. Because I believe in economic systems to create circular local economies, but it's not going to happen without the help of some basic changes to the Farm Bill. That has to happen.
I hate that, but Danny, one of the things I love about Food Tank and the refresh policy is this active belief that technology can shine light on things. And that's just something that we've seen. I mean, we were not 11 months ago. But when you use the spotlight of technology, you can really answer questions, and you can start connecting the dots. And so, we're designing our program where we can create a secure RESTful API where we can share that data out and begin working with others. Because as we learn what's behind hunger, which just doesn't make sense in the US, but when you learn what's behind it, you find that there are many people doing great work that if you could just connect with them, you can solve the problems collectively. And too often, I think we have approached, whether it's a transparency in our food chain and our distribution or feeding people, we've just siloed these conversations. And so we're grateful just to be a part of this dialogue from this side of the house on how does it all work together and not just one piece of it.
I'd love to jump in here on a couple of things. I mean, so many thoughts, but I think what really bubbles up is that we spend a lot of time and money moving food around, right? And there's a lot of cost to that, and that cost sort of is in the way of sometimes really getting that food to the right places and the right people. And for us, one of the things we've really been noting is how much, and we have I'd be remiss not to mention we have a new analysis at Refed coming out tomorrow, so I can't give away the whole show, but one of the things we've noticed is just how much food is being left on farms. Fresh, nutritious produce that is not making it off of farms. And I think there's so much there. There are reasons it's happening, right? But they're not like reasons we can't overcome. And I do think it's a combination of technology and policy that's going to get us there. Technology, because it can help us find homes for those foods, before they're harvested, kind of really identifying, letting the world know they're going to be available, or they're available, tomorrow. We have the ability to now kind of flash broadcast that information, and then being able to figure out how to get it there, maybe even using technology to hitch rides, because transportation is such a barrier for donated food in particular. But how do we get more of that fresh produce off the farm and to people? And when we take out a lot of that middle action, we take the cost down too. And so how do we use these online marketplaces and the ability to connect directly with consumers, online SNAP now, to get that produce to people at lower cost, and also get farmers and more income out of that as well. So I really see like a huge opportunity, some big nuts to crack, but I think it's there.
Before I hand it back to Chloe, I just want to say everyone should look at the refresh, the Refed report that's coming out tomorrow. I saw a sneak preview. I'm very excited. I think everyone should be. Thank you so much, Dana. And just going back to what Matt and Rick said, we do need more holistic policies that really combine technology and policy. And Matt is absolutely correct. We cannot go back to the food policies that we had 10 years ago. We have to keep moving forward. We have to keep pushing. That a decade ago is not going to work for us.
100%. And which is why I was going to say for my next question, you know, obviously the refed report's coming out tomorrow, but we also have a potential confirmation hearing tomorrow. So I know that's very top of mind for a lot of folks. So we've been thinking federally because of that, because this is obviously we're talking about national legislators here, but I also want to hear more. What could be done state, municipality wise? What are there policies that would make your lives and your local work easier? Because, you know, Rick, Matt, you're doing work in local communities, obviously refed is as well.
Well, a big one on our end is, just allowing more funding for conservation stewardship and changing land from conventional systems so farms have basic protections like insurance. You know, a lot of farmers are afraid to change crops over because they're not federally insured cropping systems. And, you know, it's opportunities where farmers could make more money, where they could create more security in their communities, and we could create diets for animals and people that were healthy, built upon the idea of actually whole foods. And that is unfortunately not written into current policy in the Farm Bill, and that is the biggest part of the Farm Bill that was decimated over the course of the last few years. So that's really the big one is more funding for ag development and CSP.
Along those lines, I think one of the experiences that we had last year was trying to apply traceability to the Farmers to Families program. And I think transparency on funding and how that's done would be massive, because if you look back at how the money was distributed through Farmers to Families, and you see stories of, you know, wedding planners getting $35 million for fulfilling food boxes when they have no business in that, the amount of waste in terms of funding, I think is just fundamentally, if there was a merit-based policy that would be constructed by folks like on this panel who are way smarter than I am on this topic, but just that one very visceral experience we had of having an ecosystem of partners that would be qualified to deliver something like that at scale, only to see it basically funding friends of politicians, whether through lobbies or donations. And, you know, I often question recently, like, what's the fine line between sponsorship and bribery when it comes to some of these policy decisions? You know, that I think fundamentally, so transparency and funding would be a transformative policy, I think.
It's interesting from our experience. So the Farmers Families box, we with our farmer worked on that grant. So a quick answer is our policymakers have to be willing to think out of the box. And so we applied, and we did not get any assistance at all to feeding those families. And our offering was very different. We will deliver this directly to literally it's packed at the farm, and within 2 days it arrives to the front door. It's cold. There's leafy greens, collards, peas. It's cold, and it gets to the family. But the cost of that's a little bit different. And when you're in a lowest bidder mentality, what you can get is either kind of last mile stuff, or you gotta do the massive drop off, but you don't get the information. You don't collect, you're feeding, but you don't know who you're feeding or why they need food. And that just perpetuates the problem of, now I have to feed you. And unless I begin to understand what's behind that, I've got to feed their children and the next generation, and that's kind of where we've been. So we brought this thinking, wow, great. I mean, families in need and seniors in need, farm to table, and literally it's packed at the farm. Now, it's too out of the box, and it wasn't kind of the mobile drop. And when I think about our policies around this, it's like drop and go, drop and go. And there's got to be more than that, so that we can start connecting the real root causes and working with people like Matt and Mark and Dana and others to solve all the problems. Because just getting to the farmers, we're feeding farmers in America. We're reducing waste and lowering the footprint, because it literally goes from there. Within 2 days, it arrives to the family. So we have to be willing to think out of the box, locally, regionally, and federally, if we're going to make a difference.
Dana, anything else to add on the policy front from Chloe's question?
I guess I would just say, I think the box program that these guys are talking about had a lot of issues in implementation, but the concept was not bad, right? And I think we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think the idea that there's some federal funding that goes to getting produce that would otherwise go to waste off of farms and getting it very close to, if not directly, to people who need it, that's good, right? And there were a lot of devils in the details in the implementation during this kind of pandemic round, I'll call it. But I'm excited at the precedence of the concept being set politically.
Yeah,
I would just add, there are some other belt and suspenders type things in association with SNAP that are big problems. Just, in our experience at, when I was at Blue Apron, just the technology for SNAP cards is so far behind the rest of the world that it has to be a physical card presence in conjunction with use of an ID. And there's no good. I know there's a trial out there for a few years, which still isn't robustly built out, where you could use SNAP with digital interface in modern food companies. And a lot of the things we're talking about are just the U.S. government being really, really behind the times of like every industry on the planet in terms of just being able to use your benefits in a landscape that's changing. And how easy would it be to do distribution if you could just do simple things like like server lists and identify how to use those benefits in a digital landscape from most Americans, even who are food secure, now have smartphones. So I think we really have to just upgrade our systems in this country and allow ourselves to be able to distribute foods in a way that is more suitable to a growing digital community.
Yeah, if I could jump back in there on Dana's point, because we move boxes of foods to families in need across the country. I don't want a family food box program to go away at all. When I look at kind of how it plays out, for example, this go around, you've got to be able to do fresh produce, but also meat and dairy liquids. Which I think are all great. When I look at my specific population, though, the top 10 illnesses are all require an anti-inflammatory diet. And so what you often tend to get is the hearty, the carrots, the apples, and those are good, but they need leafy greens and a variety of fruits. And, I look at our top 3 diseases, 60% of our arthritis, hypertension, and diabetes. They have to have a robust fresh produce and greens in their diet. So I think we start building in too many walls and criteria that often just addresses interest more than it does just the health issues of the people we're trying to feed. And so just need to think out of the box. And I think that's just, to Matt's point, when technology is behind or the delivery model is, how long have we had Amazon now? Or, forever. So it's about thinking differently about what we do as it relates to food.
Absolutely. All of these out of the box, both policies and technologies really need to happen, and they need to happen soon so that, people are fed, people feel secure, and these technologies can actually thrive. We have sadly are about to run out of time. There's so much more to talk about on this issue of transparency. I want to thank Chloe and all of our panelists and all of our viewers for watching and listening. A reminder that this discussion will also be available on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. And please join us back here tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our next discussion on broadband expansion in rural areas. Everyone, please stay safe and well, and thank you again.
Thank you, Danny.